Sir, if that homeless old man is still sitting there when the Admiral arrives, your career won't be the only thing disappearing today. The sharp whisper cut through the salty morning air, just as Lieutenant Nathan Brooks adjusted the white gloves on his dress uniform and stared across the packed graduation lawn of the Annapolis Naval Academy. Hundreds of polished white chairs stretched beneath rows of snapping American flags, while proud families filled the marble courtyard with nervous applause and camera flashes. But near the very back row, beneath the shadow of a stone memorial wall, one seat remained strangely isolated. An old man sat there alone. Nobody had chosen the empty chairs beside him. Walter Hayes looked like he had wandered in from the streets outside the academy gates. His gray coat hung loose across his thin shoulders, the fabric weathered and faded by too many winters. His boots were old work boots, cracked at the leather seams and stained by miles of walking. A frayed canvas bag rested beside his chair, its strap wrapped twice around his wrist, like he'd learned long ago never to let go of the few things he owned. A cold Atlantic wind rolled across the academy yard, tugging gently at his silver beard, but the old man never seemed to notice. He simply sat there, watching the empty graduation stage with the stillness of someone who had spent a lifetime wading through storms far worse than this one. Brooks narrowed his eyes. The ceremony was less than 12 minutes from starting, and every detail had already become a pressure point. Reporters stood near the front barriers, Navy families filled the bleachers, rear admirals and senators gathered beneath a blue canopy beside the podium. Most important of all, Admiral Richard Kane himself was due to arrive at any moment. The Academy had polished every inch of the grounds since before sunrise. Brass railings gleamed beneath the Maryland sun. The marble pathways had been washed twice. Even the flower beds along the courtyard edges looked surgically arranged. And now this old drifter sat directly inside camera range, like a stain nobody could erase. Brooks started down the aisle, his polished shoes striking the pavement with clipped precision. Two young cadets, standing nearby, glanced toward the old man before quickly looking away again. One whispered something under his breath. The other gave a nervous laugh. Walter Hayes heard neither reaction. His pale blue eyes remained fixed on the stage ahead, as though he could already see something no one else could. Brooks stopped directly in front of him. "Sir," he said firmly, keeping his voice low enough to avoid drawing attention, "this section is reserved for Academy families and honored guests." Walter slowly lifted his eyes. They were calm, not confused, not embarrassed. Calm in a way that unsettled Brooks more than anger would have. "I know," the old man said quietly. His voice sounded rough, like gravel pressed smooth by decades of tidewater. Brooks forced a professional smile that carried no warmth at all. "Then you also know this event isn't open to the public?" Walter looked toward the stage again. "I was invited." The answer landed strangely flat in the air between them. Brooks studied him more carefully now. No visible credentials. No academy badge. No military ribbons. Nothing except a tiny silver coin resting loosely between the old man's fingers, its worn surface catching brief flashes of sunlight whenever the wind shifted. Brooks felt irritation tighten behind his jaw. Around them, the graduation crowd continued filling with movement and noise. Families hugged. Chairs scraped against concrete. Somewhere near the entrance gate, a Navy band began warming up brass instruments with sharp, fragmented notes that echoed across the courtyard. But the empty seats surrounding Walter Hayes remained untouched. Nobody wanted to sit beside him. "Sir," Brooks said more sharply now before the Admiral arrives, "I need you to gather your belongings and move outside the ceremony perimeter." Walter finally looked directly at him again. There was no challenge in his face, no fear either, just an old exhaustion that somehow carried dignity instead of weakness. "No," he said softly. The single word stopped Brooks cold for half a second. Not because it was loud, because it wasn't. The old man said it with the quiet certainty of someone who had once made decisions under pressure far heavier than a graduation ceremony. Nearby conversations slowly began fading as people sensed tension building. A woman in the second row lowered her phone. One cadet turned fully around in his seat to watch. Brooks straightened his shoulders, suddenly aware of every pair of eyes drifting toward them. "You don't seem to understand the situation," he said. Walter Hayes slowly closed his fingers around the silver coin in his palm, while the distant sound of helicopter rotors rolled faintly across the Chesapeake sky. Lieutenant Brooks glanced toward the academy entrance as the distant rotor noise faded behind the heavy coastal wind. Black government SUVs had already begun lining the circular drive outside the graduation lawn, their dark windows reflecting rows of white uniforms and fluttering Navy flags. Time was running out. He leaned closer to Walter Hayes, lowering his voice another notch. "Sir, this is your last chance to leave quietly." Walter did not answer immediately. His weathered fingers moved slowly across the edge of the silver coin in his palm, tracing the worn grooves like a man reading Braille from another lifetime. Around them, sunlight glimmered across polished brass buttons and ceremonial swords, while proud parents filled the air with nervous excitement. None of it seemed to reach the old man sitting alone in the final row. He looked untouched by the noise, untouched by the judgment. Brooks followed the direction of Walter's gaze toward the graduation stage. The old veteran was staring at the podium with an expression that looked less like curiosity and more like memory. "You are causing a disruption," Brooks pressed. "This ceremony has security protocols." Walter finally spoke. "I know something about security protocols." The answer was calm. Too calm. Brooks felt irritation rise again beneath his collar. Before he could respond, a young voice interrupted nearby. "Sir?" Both men turned. A first-class cadet stood 2 rows away, holding a folded academy program against his chest. Ethan Cole. Tall, clean-cut, barely 22. His expression carried the hesitant uncertainty of someone stepping into a situation he already regretted approaching. "Lieutenant," Ethan said carefully, "the ceremony is about to begin." Brooks barely looked at him. "Then you should be in your assigned seat, cadet." Ethan nodded quickly, but his eyes drifted toward Walter Hayes and stopped on the silver coin resting in the old man's hand. Something about it caught his attention immediately. The coin looked ancient compared to the polished challenge coins sold in academy gift shops. Its edges were scarred and uneven, and at the center sat the faded outline of an old destroyer, crest nearly rubbed smooth by time. Ethan frowned slightly. He had seen that symbol before, somewhere inside the academy archives, somewhere important. Walter noticed the young cadet staring. Slowly he closed his hand around the coin again. Then from beyond the marble gates, a sharp whistle echoed across the courtyard as the Marine Honor Guard snapped into position. The Admiral had arrived. The entire courtyard shifted at once. Conversations collapsed into murmurs as rows of cadets straightened their white jackets and snapped into formation beneath the bright Annapolis sun. Beyond the gates, the Marine Honor Guard marched with mechanical precision across the stone pathway while camera shutters clicked like distant stamps. Lieutenant Brooks immediately stepped back from Walter Hayes and adjusted his posture, every muscle tightening beneath the pressure of inspection. Admiral Richard Kane had a reputation that traveled through the academy like weather. Men stood straighter around him. Officers measured every word. Even senior commanders watched their tone when the Admiral entered a room. Brooks glanced once more toward Walter, frustration simmering behind his disciplined expression. "You need to move now," he said quietly. "If security handles this instead of me, it will not go well for you." Walter slowly lifted his eyes toward the entrance gate, where the first black SUV had stopped beside the red carpet. His expression did not change. "I have been removed from better places than this," he said. The answer landed harder than Brooks expected. Not disrespectful, just honest. A breeze swept through the courtyard, rattling rows of Academy banners overhead. Ethan Cole remained frozen near his seat, his eyes still fixed on the old silver coin hidden inside Walter's hand. Something about the destroyer crest kept pulling at his memory, like a thread he could not quite grab. Then he remembered where he had seen it. Memorial Hall, third-floor archive wing. An old black-and-white photograph hanging beside a display about naval rescue operations during Desert Storm. Ethan felt a chill move through him despite the warm Maryland air. He looked back at Walter more carefully now. The old man's posture was tired, but not weak. His shoulders carried the quiet heaviness of someone who had spent years carrying responsibility no one else ever noticed. Near the front rows, applause suddenly erupted as Admiral Kane stepped out from the vehicle in full-dress uniform. Sunlight flashed across the gold braid on his sleeves, while reporters surged forward behind the barriers. The Admiral acknowledged the crowd with a brief nod before beginning the long walk toward the graduation stage. Then, for the first time since arriving, his eyes drifted across the sea of white uniforms toward the final row in the back. The applause rolled across the courtyard in steady waves as Admiral Richard Kane moved along the front aisle beside Academy officials and decorated officers. Sunlight flashed against the gold stars on his shoulders, while television crews adjusted their lenses to follow every step. Parents rose from their seats, trying to capture photographs. Cadets stood motionless in perfect formation beneath the snapping Navy banners overhead. But Ethan Cole barely noticed any of it now. His pulse had begun climbing for a completely different reason. He slipped one hand into the pocket of his dress trousers and pulled out his phone, shielding the screen against his Academy program so Lieutenant Brooks would not notice. His fingers moved quickly across the Academy archive database, while his eyes darted between the old silver coin and the search results loading on the screen. USS Blackwater, Desert Storm, Emergency Recovery Operations. Then a photograph appeared, grainy, sun-faded, more than 30 years old. Ethan stopped breathing for half a second. The man in the photograph looked younger, broader in the shoulders, standing beside a damaged destroyer deck under smoke-stained skies. But the eyes were unmistakable. Walter Hayes. Ethan looked back toward the old man sitting alone in the final row, the same calm expression, the same impossible stillness. A cold pressure settled into Ethan's chest as he continued reading. A NAS civilian contractor attached to classified naval recovery operation. Commendation sealed by Department of the Navy order. Restricted access. Ethan swallowed hard. Restricted access files inside Academy archives were almost never visible to cadets. He scrolled lower. One line near the bottom froze him completely. Personal recognition authorized by Admiral Richard Kane. Ethan slowly lifted his eyes toward the ceremony aisle, just as Admiral Kane reached the center walkway below the graduation stage. At that exact moment, Walter Hayes loosened his grip slightly on the silver coin, and sunlight struck the worn destroyer, crest hard enough for the Admiral to finally see it from across the courtyard. Admiral Kane stopped so suddenly that the officer walking beside him nearly collided with his shoulder. The applause continued for another 2 seconds, before slowly collapsing into scattered confusion across the courtyard. Reporters lowered their cameras. Cadets exchanged uncertain glances. Even the Marine Honor Guard near the stage seemed to tighten in place, without understanding why the ceremony had suddenly lost its rhythm. Kane's eyes remained fixed on the final row, on the silver coin resting inside Walter Hayes' hand. For a brief moment, the Admiral did not look like one of the most powerful men in the United States Navy. He looked older, Not physically, emotionally, like a man staring straight into a memory he had spent decades trying to carry with dignity. Lieutenant Brooks noticed the change immediately. His stomach tightened. "Sir?" he asked quietly, stepping toward the Admiral. Kane did not answer. The wind swept across the courtyard again, carrying the distant smell of salt water from the Chesapeake Bay, while rows of Academy flags cracked sharply overhead. Walter Hayes slowly rose from his chair, not fully straight. Age and years had settled into his bones too deeply for that, but the movement alone seemed to pull every eye in the courtyard toward him. Ethan Cole watched in stunned silence as the Admiral took one slow step away from the stage, then another. The polished black shoes of the Navy's highest-ranking officer echoed against the marble walkway with measured precision. He was no longer walking toward the podium. He was walking toward the old man in the last row. Brooks turned pale beneath the collar of his dress uniform. "What is happening?" one cadet whispered nearby. Nobody answered him. Nobody could. Because something had shifted in the atmosphere of the entire Academy grounds. The ceremony no longer felt like a graduation. It felt like history had just walked back into the room. The only sounds left in the courtyard were the sharp clicks of Admiral Kane's shoes against the marble and the restless snapping of flags above the Academy lawn. More than 2,000 people watched him leave the ceremony aisle without a single explanation. Senators turned in confusion. Academy officers exchanged tense looks. Cameramen scrambled sideways, trying to understand why the keynote speaker for the graduation ceremony had abandoned the stage before giving a single word. Walter Hayes remained standing beside the final row chair, with one hand resting lightly on the worn canvas bag at his feet. He did not look surprised. That unsettled Ethan Cole more than anything else. It was as if the old man had known this moment would happen eventually. Lieutenant Brooks stepped quickly toward the Admiral, his voice suddenly strained beneath the pressure building around him. "Sir, this individual does not have authorization to be here." Admiral Kane never slowed down. His eyes stayed locked on Walter Hayes, with a focus so intense it seemed to erase everyone else from the courtyard. "I know exactly who he is," Kane said quietly. The answer hit Brooks like cold water. Ethan saw the color drain from the lieutenant's face almost instantly. Around them, whispers began spreading through the crowd in nervous waves. Cadets leaned toward each other. Parents stared toward the back row. Nobody understood why the Admiral's expression carried something far deeper than recognition. Respect, real respect, the kind that could not be performed for cameras. Kane finally stopped less than 6 feet from Walter Hayes. For a long moment, neither man spoke. The wind moved softly through the courtyard, while the old silver coin reflected faint flashes of sunlight between Walter's fingers. Then the Admiral looked down at the coin and exhaled slowly through his nose. "I thought that was lost in the Gulf," he said quietly. Walter's weathered face softened just slightly. "You gave it to me," he answered. "Figured I should keep it safe." A silence heavier than any applause settled across the Academy grounds. Admiral Kane stared at the old silver coin for several long seconds, as if the years between then and now had suddenly collapsed into nothing. The crowded Academy courtyard disappeared from his face. So did the cameras, the politicians, the ceremony. All that remained in his eyes was memory. Walter Hayes slowly turned the coin once between his fingers, the worn destroyer crest catching another faint flash of sunlight. "Still carrying it after all this time," Kane murmured. Walter gave a small shrug beneath his faded coat. "Some things are harder to throw away than others." The answer carried a quiet weight that settled over everyone close enough to hear it. Ethan Cole watched the Admiral carefully now. The expression on Kane's face no longer belonged to a commanding officer inspecting a ceremony. It belonged to a man standing beside someone he owed far more than rank could repay. Lieutenant Brooks shifted uncomfortably near the aisle, suddenly aware that every decision he had made during the last 20 minutes was unraveling in front of the entire academy. One of the reporters near the front barriers raised a camera and zoomed tightly toward Walter Hayes. Others followed immediately. The atmosphere had changed completely. Nobody saw a homeless old man anymore. They saw a mystery, standing beside the Admiral of the United States Navy. Kane glanced down at the worn canvas bag near Walter's chair. "You still carrying that old thing, too?" A faint smile touched Walter's face for the first time all morning. "It still works." The Admiral actually laughed under his breath, softly, honestly. The sound stunned several officers standing nearby, because men at Kane's level almost never showed emotion in public. Ethan noticed something else then. The older officers surrounding the stage had begun recognizing the name Walter Hayes, as whispers moved quietly between them. One commander's eyes widened. Another slowly removed his cover in silence. The realization was spreading now, piece by piece, through the entire chain of command. The silence across the academy courtyard no longer felt confused. It felt reverent. Admiral Kane looked around slowly at the gathered cadets and officers, then back toward Walter Hayes, standing beside the empty chair in the final row. "You disappeared after Bahrain," Kane said quietly. "Nobody could find you." Walter lowered his eyes briefly toward the coin in his hand. "Was not hard," he answered. Most people stopped looking. The words landed like stones in still water. Ethan Cole saw several officers nearby glance away uncomfortably. Lieutenant Brooks remained frozen near the aisle, unable to reconcile the image of the homeless old man he had tried to remove, with the man now standing face to face with an admiral. Kane studied Walter for another long moment before speaking again. "You should have contacted me." Walter gave a faint, tired smile. "You were busy becoming important." A few nervous laughs escaped from the surrounding officers, but the Admiral did not laugh this time. His expression turned heavier. "Older. I became alive," Kane said softly. The entire courtyard seemed to absorb the sentence at once. No dramatic tone, no performance, just truth. Ethan felt a chill move through him again as pieces of the story finally began fitting together inside his mind. Whatever had happened decades earlier aboard the USS Blackwater had clearly changed the course of Admiral Kane's entire life. Reporters had stopped whispering now. Cameras remained trained entirely on Walter Hayes. One elderly Navy commander near the stage slowly stepped forward and stared at Walter in disbelief. "My God," the commander muttered under his breath. "I heard stories about him at Norfolk." Nearby cadets immediately turned toward the officer. "Stories about who?" one whispered. The commander never took his eyes off Walter Hayes, the man who walked back into a burning engine compartment 3 times to pull sailors out after the missile strike. The wind swept hard across the courtyard again, rattling every Navy flag above the graduation lawn, while complete silence settled over the crowd for the second time that morning. No one moved. The entire graduation ceremony remained suspended beneath the bright Maryland sky, while the old commander's words settled over the crowd like a slow incoming tide. Cadets who had spent 4 years studying naval history now stared at Walter Hayes with open disbelief. Some looked toward Admiral Kane for confirmation. They found it immediately in his face. Kane stepped closer to Walter and lowered his voice, though the silence around them carried every word farther than he intended. "They never told the full story about that day," he said. Walter looked out across the rows of young graduates, standing motionless beneath the flags. "Good," he answered quietly. "The sailors who did not come home deserve the attention more than I did." Ethan Cole felt something tighten in his chest at the sentence. There was no pride in Walter's voice, no attempt to sound heroic. That somehow made the story feel even larger. One of the reporters near the barricades finally spoke up carefully. "Admiral Kane, sir, is this the Walter Hayes from the Blackwater incident?" Several cameras immediately shifted toward the Admiral. Kane turned slowly toward the crowd for the first time since leaving the aisle. The expression on his face carried none of the polished distance public officials usually wore in front of cameras. "Yes," he said simply. A stunned murmur rolled through the courtyard. Lieutenant Brooks closed his eyes briefly, as if trying to undo the last 30 minutes in his head. Nearby, Ethan watched two senior Navy captains quietly snap to attention beside the back row without being ordered. Others followed a second later. The movement spread silently outward through the officers' section like a ripple across still water. Walter noticed it immediately and shifted uncomfortably beneath the attention. "Richard," he muttered softly, "do not turn this into a circus." Kane looked back at him and shook his head once. "Too late for that," he said. Then the Admiral straightened fully beneath the sunlight and turned toward the thousands of cadets standing across the Academy lawn. "Midshipmen," he called out, his voice carrying hard and clear through the courtyard, "you are looking at one of the bravest men the United States Navy never officially thanked." The words rolled across the Academy grounds with the force of a cannon blast. Thousands of cadets stood frozen beneath the bright afternoon sun, while Admiral Kane remained beside Walter Hayes, near the final row of seats. The wind tugged at the old veteran's faded coat as cameras zoomed tighter and tighter toward his weathered face. Walter looked deeply uncomfortable now, like a man who had spent decades avoiding attention only to have it suddenly crash down around him all at once. Kane turned fully toward the graduating class. 32 years ago," he said, his voice steady and carrying across the courtyard speakers, "the USS Blackwater suffered catastrophic damage during an operation in the Gulf. Every cadet listened without moving. Even the reporters stopped speaking. Communications failed. Internal systems collapsed. Smoke filled half the lower compartments." Kane paused briefly, his eyes shifting toward Walter. Most men were trying to get out. One man kept going back in. Walter lowered his head slightly, almost annoyed by the direction the story was taking. Ethan Cole noticed it immediately. The old veteran did not enjoy hearing himself described this way. Kane continued anyway. He carried sailors to safety until his hands could barely function. Then he went back again because he heard someone trapped below deck. The courtyard had become so quiet that the distant gulls circling over the Chesapeake could be heard between sentences. Lieutenant Brooks stared at Walter Hayes as if seeing him for the first time. The old commander near the stage slowly removed his cover completely and held it against his chest. More officers followed. Then, without command, dozens of cadets across the Academy lawn began standing straighter. Some instinctively placed their hands behind their backs at parade rest. Respect was spreading through the crowd faster than explanation. Kane finally looked back toward Walter, and his voice softened. "That man saved my life before I ever earned these stars." "Eow," the Admiral lifted one hand slowly toward the gold insignia on his shoulder. "Every promotion I ever received happened because Walter Hayes walked into danger when everyone else thought the ship was already lost." Admiral Kane took one slow step backward and straightened his uniform beneath the whipping coastal wind. The gold braid on his sleeves shimmered beneath the afternoon sunlight, while thousands of cadets watched him in complete silence. Then, without warning, the Admiral came sharply to attention in front of Walter Hayes. Gasps spread instantly through the crowd. Lieutenant Brooks felt his throat tighten. Ethan Cole stared in disbelief as one of the highest-ranking officers in the United States Navy raised his hand in a full formal salute toward the homeless veteran standing beside the final row chair. Kane held the salute with absolute stillness, not for cameras, not for ceremony, for gratitude. Walter looked caught somewhere between discomfort and exhaustion. He glanced briefly toward the rows of cadets, now watching him with stunned reverence, instead of suspicion. "Richard," he muttered quietly, "you do not have to do this." The Admiral never lowered his hand. "Yes," he said firmly, "I do." The words carried through the courtyard speakers and settled over the academy lawn, like thunder rolling across open water. Then something extraordinary happened. One cadet near the center section rose to attention and saluted. Another followed, then another. Within seconds, the movement spread through the graduation field in perfect silence. White uniforms snapped upright, row after row, beneath the bright Maryland sky, until nearly every graduating midshipman stood, saluting Walter Hayes. Parents in the bleachers rose to their feet. Officers removed their covers. Even the reporters lowered their cameras for a moment, suddenly aware they were witnessing something larger than a story. Lieutenant Brooks stood frozen near the aisle, shame written clearly across his face now. Walter slowly looked around at the thousands of young men and women saluting him with absolute sincerity. His weathered hands tightened slightly around the old silver coin as emotion finally reached his eyes for the first time that morning. Not pride, something quieter, something heavier, the look of a man who never expected to be remembered. As the ceremony finally resumed, Admiral Kane quietly moved Walter Hayes from the lonely back row to the seat beside him at center stage. Thousands of cadets watched the old veteran sit beneath the academy flags, with the same calm dignity he had carried all morning, and for the first time in decades, Walter Hayes no longer looked invisible. Some men lose rank, some lose homes, but real honor, once earned, never fades.